Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Hay Festival Book Club. I'm Christina Patterson, and I'm absolutely delighted to be chairing this event tonight with Wendy Cope. I'm a journalist, author, broadcaster, critic for the Sunday Times, and a former director of the Poetry Society. But far more importantly, in terms of tonight, I've been a fan of Wendy's work for decades. I've been asked, first of all, to remind you that the Hay Festival is a charity with year-round activities to connect audiences with artists. Thank you to everyone for their continued support and engagement. The Orange and Other Poems is the Hay Festival Book Club pick for January. Copies are available for purchase from the Hay Festival website, or you can buy a copy, of course, from your local bookseller. The Hay Festival Book Club is supported by the Unwin Charitable Trust. February selection is James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room, and details of the event are online now. I'll be in conversation with Wendy for about 45 minutes, and then I'll ask some of the questions that you book club members have sent through before. So, Wendy Cope was born in Kent and worked for 15 years as a primary school teacher before publishing her first collection of poems, Making Cocoa for Kingsley Amis. It was, in a phrase rarely used in poetry, an instant bestseller. It was followed by Serious Concerns, If I Don't Know, Two Cures for Love, which is her early selected poems, Family Values, Christmas Poems, and Anecdotal Evidence. Wendy is also the author of a prose collection, Life, Love and the Archers, two books for children, Twiddling Your Thumbs and The River Girl, and the editor of a number of anthologies, including the Faber Book of Bedtime Stories. She's received a Chumley Award and a Michael Broad Award for Light Verse from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and in 2010 she was awarded an OBE. I worked at Faber as a press officer in 1988, 2 years after Making Cocoa for Kingsley Amis came out. I remember the level of fame and interest, which was then incredibly rare for a poet. Many years later, when I became a full-time journalist, I interviewed Wendy. I've interviewed hundreds of writers and artists over the years, but for me, this one was personal because Wendy's work has always meant so much to me. And it's an absolute joy to be talking to her again at a time when her work has captured the attention of a whole new generation. So welcome, Wendy Cope, and would you please start by reading a poem?
Thank you. The Orange. At lunchtime, I bought a huge orange. The size of it made us all laugh. I peeled it and shared it with Robert and Dave. They got quarters and I had a half. And that orange, it made me so happy, as ordinary things often do just lately. The shopping, a walk in the park. This is peace and contentment. It's new. The rest of the day was quite easy. I did all the jobs on my list and enjoyed them and had some time over. I love you. I'm glad I exist.
Oh, do you know, Wendy, just hearing that poem makes me want to cry because I know, obviously because it's a beautiful poem, but also because one knows how hard won that happiness was. That poem, of course, went viral. How did you find out about that and what has happened since?
Somebody's daughter told a friend of mine. And then I got one or two, and then one or two other people. It was through other people's children that that they say, you're really big on TikTok, and I've never looked at TikTok, so it was it was a nice surprise.
And I don't think you were ever a great fan of social media. Has it changed your view of it?
Well, what it has changed my view of, I'm very fanatical about copyright, and it's this all completely illegal breach of copyright, but it's done me a lot of good. So, no, I don't. I lurk on Twitter. I can read other people's tweets, but I never tweet myself. I'm not going to start calling it X.
No.
And I've never been on Facebook. Because I was afraid that lots of people would want to be my friend and they would be offended if I didn't want. I don't quite know how it works, but I thought if all my readers wanted to be my friend, I hadn't really got time. So I'm not on. I do look at Twitter, but nobody knows I'm there.
And you touched on the copyright issue. I mean, you've been very fierce and many writers have been very grateful to you for your fierceness on copyright issues, because obviously if people don't pay for your work, then writers don't get paid. Have your, beyond what you've just mentioned in relation to TikTok and how it has obviously given you a whole new generation of readers, which is wonderful. Do you think the internet meant that anyone could put anything up? How has that changed? Putting aside TikTok, generally speaking, what's your view of of copyright now? What writers can do to protect themselves?
Well, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, up until now, I've always thought it was a complete disaster, because I mean, if you can't put a whole novel on the internet, or if you did, it would be more expensive to sort of print it out than to buy it. But with short poems, if they're all on the internet, people don't need to buy the books. And I'm sure it affects my sales. But what has happened with The Orange is that people put all these poems on the internet, and then my publisher's published a book, and I'm going to make money out of it. So it's sort of turned out better. But before that, I've actually been absolutely driven crazy by the fact that so many of my poems are on the internet. And I'm sure it must affect sales of my books.
And actually, you can put a whole book on the internet. I've found illegal PDFs of both my books on the internet. So people find ways around it. So, yeah.
And what do people download them to their phones or something?
Yeah, they just can open them on their Kindles or whatever. So it's kind of trying to cage something. Well, basically put the genie back in the bottle, which is a very hard thing to do. Yes. But I'm very glad that in your particular case this has worked out. So will you tell us a bit about the process of choosing the poems for The Orange?
Well, I did look once. I was given, Faber sent me some links to TikTok, so I actually looked at it for the first time in my life. And in the book, all the poems that I found on TikTok is mainly The Orange, but there are some others. So several of them are poems that were already on TikTok. And then I chose other poems that I thought might appeal to TikTokers. They're not too, there's no literary jokes in The Orange, because
no Jason Struggle doing the waste.
Nothing like that. No, that's it. So most of my poems are easy to understand, but there's a few of them, especially the early ones, that were parodies and literary jokes. So there's a more limited audience for that. So it's all poems about life. Yeah, and yes, just what I thought. And I think Jane made one or two suggestions, my editor, but it was all very easy. It's all been very easy. I mean, I've got my collected poems coming out next autumn, and that's not going to be easy. That's going to, so much fussing about and proofreading, anyway. But this one's been, and the other wonderful thing has been that all the publicity. I mean, I had a back operation 2 months ago. And Faber understood that I couldn't really be expected to do anything. But also because of the TikTok thing, a lot of the promotion was on the internet. I didn't have to do anything. I didn't have to go anywhere. I didn't have to do anything. I mean, there was one event, but it was quite soon after. I mean, it was too soon for me to be able to go to London and do it. So they got Monica Dolan to come along and read my poems. I had this event at Faber. But it's been, I realise I'm going to get a shock in the autumn when I actually have to start doing the normal stuff, because the number of times I've said to people, remind me never to publish another book. Well, I mean, you've been through it all as well.
Well, no, Wendy, I haven't been through it as a bestseller, and that is a completely different experience.
Well, I mean, my first 2 books were bestsellers. Since then, the sales haven't been as good, but I still have to do a certain amount, and I know if I don't do it, the book won't sell.
So there's a wonderful kind of full circle sense for me about this evening with, Making Cocoa becoming an instant bestseller and The Orange. Obviously, these are poems that have been around for a while, but for the people who discovered them, it's like an instant bestseller. And one of the things that made Making Cocoa by Kingsley Amis an instant bestseller was the fact that it was very funny. And frankly, not all that much contemporary poetry is funny. Can you tell us a bit about where your sense of humour came from and what are the qualities necessary to turn that sense of humour into art?
I don't know. My father had a good sense of humour. I suppose that may have had some influence. I don't know. I don't know. I mean, the first thing I ever wrote when I was 11, we had to do an entertainment. No, apart from having to write stuff for in school lessons, but I was in a boarding house, a boarding school, and we were the youngest year. And there was this sort of thing where every year had to provide some entertainment. And I wrote this play, which was a kind of send up of life at the school. And then I tried to direct it, and that was no good because people just wouldn't do what I told them. So the bossiest girl in our year took over as director, and then we did the play, and it was a huge hit. I mean, that was amazing to me. But so that was when I was 11. So I don't know why I've got a sense of humour.
Some critics have assumed that funny means not serious. Amazing, because have they read Beckett? Clearly not. And have dismissed your work as light verse.
Yes.
Do you feel in any way vindicated by this reignited passion for your work?
No, I don't think it'll have any effect on the people that think I'm just a comic. I mean, I don't think that will have. There are people who sneer at my work, and I don't think the popularity of The Orange will. Far from it. I mean, because part of the problem with making cocoa was that it was so popular and it was infuriating for some other poets. Yeah. And there was a lot of nastiness. I mean, there was a lot of nastiness, and it hasn't. I mean, it's more or less gradually died away, but not completely. And I can understand it. I mean, I can understand it, but I certainly don't think that the popularity of The Orange, if they even know about it, which they may not, because it's not been in the national papers or on radio, it's not been anywhere except the internet, so they may not even know. But I mean, it certainly wouldn't help. No, it certainly wouldn't help to make anyone take me more seriously. Being popular doesn't help anybody to take you seriously, quite the reverse.
Yes, it was Cyril Connolly who described poets as jackals fighting over a dried up well. Yeah. And certainly when I ran the Poetry Society, I had a little taste of that. But yes, I mean, I'm just thinking now of, you said something, let me see what it was, about... You said once, you can tell if a poet is being honest. And
you mean in the poem?
In the poem, yeah.
Yes. Well, I think, yeah.
Sorry. And for me, there's a relationship here between the deceptive simplicity of your work, and of course it is deceptive, and of course some critics have taken deceptive simplicity for literal simplicity, amazingly. But I can't help feeling that there's something in that deceptive simplicity, generally, not just in you, but in all art. That means you can't actually hide behind it. You can hide the art, but you can't hide the emotion. It becomes a kind of hotline to the genuine emotion. And
well, the thing is, if the emotion isn't genuine, and if the poet isn't being honest, the poem won't work.
Exactly.
It just won't work. And
exactly.
If a poem isn't working, I have to ask myself, what was the truth of the matter, and the way to make it work is to make it truer.
Exactly. And so I think that when I asked you about vindication, I suppose I'm thinking that when something speaks, I mean, of course you can talk about something like 50 Shades of Grey, which is a huge bestseller and clearly not a literary masterpiece, or Dan Brown or whatever. However, with poetry, there's something so direct about it that I feel that if something becomes a bestseller in this way, it is, generally speaking, it's not foolproof as a rule, but I can't help
It's not, Christina, actually. If you look at the list of best-selling poetry on Amazon, a lot of the books, a lot of it's rubbish.
Oh, that's interesting. So I haven't looked at the lists of best-selling poetry on Amazon. That's
Have you
interesting.
heard of Donna Ashworth?
No.
Well, she's about the most popular poet around at the moment, and it's a sort of self-helpy kind of thing. I
Oh,
think I haven't actually read it, so I shouldn't be saying this, but I think, she's a sort of 21st century Patience Strong, I think.
oh,
And
right.
there is
How
there is
interesting.
there is a lot of rubbish out there, and also Rupi Kaur.
Yes, yes. In
I
fact,
mean, there is a lot of
even
rubbish.
as I was saying it, I was thinking Rupi Kaur actually. So I was arguing against myself even as I was saying it. But okay, all we can say is that sometimes the stuff that is true hits a chord and sells well, which is quite a rare thing in that
Yes,
case.
about selling well. I mean, there are examples of good poets who have sold really well, and there are also examples of poets, good poets who haven't sold at
Oh,
all in their
absolutely.
lifetime.
Oh, yeah.
And and it doesn't mean that they're not as good. I mean, I don't know, maybe luck comes into it. I don't know. And also marketing comes into it. I mean, the fact is that making cocoa benefited from a very enthusiastic marketing manager, Desmond Clark.
Oh,
He
yeah.
had this mission that he wanted to prove that poetry could sell, and he thought that making cocoa would be the perfect thing. But so it did get an awful lot of publicity. And this got me a reputation for being a self-publicist. It wasn't fair because it was, I mean, I wasn't complaining because I certainly wasn't complaining about my book selling, but it did get a lot of publicity, and that was one of the things that really annoyed people.
Yeah.
And so I think all you have to say is that just because something is popular doesn't necessarily mean it's rubbish.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And as you say, there was a lot of envy around when you were so successful. What effect did that have on you?
Well, I did find it very upsetting. And I think I probably wrote less. I think there are times when it sort of inhibited me from writing. Well, I heard Betjeman ask this question. People were very snide about Betjeman. He said, yes, well, it does upset me. That's all there is to say. Yes, it does upset me. A bit less now, I think, than it used to. And on the whole, I mean, it's not all poets. I mean, there are poets who've always been supportive and nice to me. And I mean, the male poets of around my age, Craig Raine, Andrew Motion, Jane, they've all been very supportive and very nice. So, I shouldn't exaggerate. But there have been times when I've been introduced to some poet I'd never met before, and they have looked as if they were being asked to shake hands with Hitler, Oh, Wendy Cope. Oh. So I think there's not so much of that now.
And of course, when Making Cocoa came out, the poems came out partly from depression. You were quite depressed. Yeah. And weirdly, I never thought of that at the time. I thought the poems spoke to me so much in their singing despair, actually, singing wit and despair. And I just thought, well, yes, that's what life is like. And I never thought of myself as suffering from depression either. But of course, in those days, people didn't talk about depression very much.
I don't know. No, perhaps not. No, I mean, certainly it's something I didn't say I could tell anyone at school, at work, about depression because I thought it would be bad for my career. And it probably would have been. But actually, when I started writing poetry, I was beginning to recover. I mean, it was part of my recovery, writing. It was a very important part of my recovery. And if I hadn't gone into analysis, I don't know if I would ever have been able to write.
I couldn't believe that your Freudian analyst, was actually called Arthur S. Couch.
He was called Arthur S. Couch. And he'd never heard of Sylvia Plath. I mean, he wasn't very keen on the idea of me being a poet because I think he thought, it's too difficult to be. What I should do is find a nice man and get married and have a family because that's the Freudian ideal. And all this nonsense about wanting to be a poet, I think he was a bit worried by it. And I remember one time when I was thinking maybe it was time to stop the analysis, and he said, "I'm afraid that if we stop now, you might go off and be Emily Dickinson. And I said, fat chance. But I know what he meant. I mean, Emily Dickinson didn't have maybe I don't know if she was miserable, but she didn't have the kind of life that a Freudian analyst would approve of.
No. So would you tell us a bit about that process of, I think you've said in the past that being a primary school teacher, in a sense, because of the emphasis in those days on creativity, which has probably diminished rather in primary school since, but
yes,
was part of what enabled you to unleash yours.
That's right.
Can you say a bit about, and also there was the musical side of things, because obviously poetry is about music as well. Can you tell us a bit about how it was that you started writing poetry and what that felt like?
Yeah, well, music was an important part of it, because one of the things because I can play the piano and the guitar a bit and sing, and in primary schools you don't have music specialists, so it's, if you can do some music, they like you to do it, which was fine with me. And so I went on lots of courses, and at that time, the people in charge of music in the London Educational Authority were very keen on getting children to compose their own music. And so on these courses, we'd sort of work in groups composing our own music, and I absolutely loved it. That really helped to wake up the creative side of me, because I thought of myself as a brainy person who wasn't at all creative. Mind you, I'm very suspicious nowadays of anyone who says I'm a very creative person. Anyway, it woke up the creative side of me. And then also I was encouraging children to write poetry. And when I looked at a child's poem, I realized I could immediately see what needed to be done to make it better, although I didn't necessarily, you have to be careful, it's their poem. But, and then I started to think, actually, I think I'll have a go at this myself. And so then I started writing poems in my spare time. But it very much came out of that creative work with children.
Sorry, carry on.
Well, the sad thing is, when I started writing poems myself, I wasn't quite so excited about getting children to write them. I still did it. But
when did you realise that poetry was going to be the thing for you? I don't mean the thing that turned your life around in becoming a bestseller. I just mean the thing in terms of
the important thing. That's quite right, and it was important. I started writing in my spare time, and I went on a couple of Arvon courses, but I still had a career as a teacher. And at a certain point, I did decide that poetry was the important thing, even if I'd never been published, even if I never get published. This is the important thing, and more important than my career in teaching. And after that, it was when I did start to get published. I mean, I don't know, but I flipped a switch, and I thought, this is the important thing. It isn't just a hobby; it's the important thing. And I may never get anywhere, but I want to, do what I can. And I think it's in one of Alison Lury's novels. She said people can usually get what they want most in life, but they don't often get their second choice as well. And a couple of poets I've been friends with who have had jobs and then got worried that they weren't thought highly enough of at work. And, I said, don't worry about that. I mean, if what's important to you is being a poet, doesn't matter. I mean, you've got to earn a living, but don't start worrying about whether people at work think you're wonderful, because that's no longer the important thing. But you do have to have a clear idea of what the important thing is.
Yeah. I trained as a coach a few years ago, and I now work as a coach.
You trained as a coach,
executive coach, and helping people in their work think about their thinking, really. And the most important question is, what's most important to you?
Yes.
Basically, that is the question that needs to shape your life in every area of your life, whether it's relationships or work.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask you about happiness. Obviously, some of the poems written out of your most deep misery are some of your funniest. And people think, oh, happy poems are funny poems, and your happy poems are funny as well. But you've written in the past that you hate it when people say happiness writes white.
Yes, because it's wrong.
Because it's wrong. Exactly. So
and I edited a whole book of poems.
I remember,
poems, just to prove it, because I was so fed up with people saying that.
Yeah.
And so I edited a whole, but actually not many of them were funny. I mean, I think was more fun. I mean, my most popular and probably my funniest book is Serious Concerns, my second book, where I was going through a really bad patch, and was really miserable, and all these love affairs that went wrong and so on. And that is my most popular book, and a lot of it is funny. So
well, yes, I mean, it's a very interesting thing, because actually I mentioned Beckett. I mean, I think you can be extremely witty and happy, but I think the depth, the humor that kind of lacerates has to come from deeper depths, maybe.
I don't know if all funny. I mean, I don't know if Michael Frayn is a miserable person. I mean, he's one of my favourite funny writers.
That's true.
So yeah. I don't think it's necessarily so, but I think often humour does come. I mean, there's kind of frame of mind where you think life is so terrible, what else can you do but laugh? And I think I've often been in that frame of mind.
Yes. Yeah. Dorothy Parker, etc. You said in an interview once that you now prefer John Clare to Keats because he's plainer.
Yes.
You've also talked about loving the work of George Herbert, A. Housman, Emily Dickinson, who your therapist didn't want you to turn into. If there's a quality that all of those poets have, what would you say it is?
Oh my goodness, I can't do that. I can't answer that. I'm sorry.
Because I can't answer it either, but I would say that there is something with all of those poets that is in your work. I know that you can't talk about, it's very hard to talk about your own influences because you don't know. But, you know, I mean, I think it's quite funny that your therapist didn't want you to be Dickinson, because in one way you are. I mean, only a tiny bit, but there is a Dickinson quality in your work.
Thank you.
And again, it's to do with that sort of singing simplicity and then the kind of flick that makes you gasp, really. Have you ever consciously, are there any qualities that you have consciously tried to achieve in terms of tone in your work?
Yes, but getting the tone right is absolutely crucial. And I tend not to go to the poets of the past for that. The two poets I go to, my two favourite living poets, are Fleur Adcock and Hugo Williams.
Exactly, absolutely. They're both you three are triplets in a way.
Well, I will often look. I mean, Fleur's very good at this kind of laid-back tone, and when I think I'm getting a bit overheated, I'll read something by Fleur, and it kind of helps to cool it down. Same with Hugo. So I don't know that. I mean, it's true, you don't know what influences you. When I wrote The River Girl, and Craig, who was my editor at the time, noticed that the meter, you know, was completely A.E. Housman, but I hadn't noticed that. Probably should have done.
You've mentioned The River Girl. Would you like to read your poem By the River?
Yeah. This is one of my Japanesey ones. It's in a Japanese form called a tanka. And as I said to you earlier, no one takes much notice of my Japanesey poems, but I like them. I love Japanese poetry. I love Japanese painting. I've got a haiku calendar there on my wall, and I buy one every year because I love. Sorry, I've written down the wrong page number. 21. Right. By the river. The day is so still, you can almost hear the heat. You can almost hear that royal blue dragonfly landing on the old white boat.
Beautiful.
I've got a picture. I wrote that. I was doing a residency in Stratford-on-Avon, and there was a heat wave, and there was an old white, just around the corner from the cottage where I was staying, there was the river, and there's this old white. I've got a picture of it. A picture that comes up on my computer still, I can't remember what you call it, is a photo I took of the old white boat in the river, because it's such a peaceful, happy scene. Yeah.
In a way, your poetry life has come in like football game of two halves, in that I think I was trying to do the maths, but I think you have, obviously much of your early work was about disappointment and love. And then you found love, and you've been in a stable domestic situation for about 30 years now.
That's right. Yes.
So it's about equal, actually, in terms of, I mean, say you started at 18-ish, from adulthood, you've had about 30 years of turbulence. Yes. And 30 years of stability. And yes. I wondered what you thought stability had brought to your poetry that you didn't have before.
Well, to begin with, when I first moved in with Lachlan, I didn't write much at all. And then I did. And I don't know, I mean, I think there isn't quite the intensity that there was in Serious Concerns. I suppose I don't know, Christina. I mean, it's changed. But I find it quite hard to say what it's brought. It was good that I began to start writing again. And of course, it's wonderful living with a poet, because I can show him things and ask him if they work. He's not infallible. Nobody's infallible. So, it's a good idea to show them to more than one person. But, we can talk about poetry, and we know what we're talking about. I might find it very difficult to live with somebody who had no interest in poetry. I mean, I think that would be difficult. Although there aren't many pairs of poets living together. I know of one or two that tried and didn't last very long. We won't mention any names.
Not in public, no.
So I'm really not sure. Certainly the subject matter is obviously different. I mean, my last book, Anecdotal Evidence, there's a lot about death, but that is, and about us not being able to be together forever. So I think it's calmer, probably, and probably not as funny. I mean, I remember saying once in an interview, I can't remember which book it was, and I was saying, the thing is that about this book, the poems, they're not all funny. And I thought this is a wonderful way to promote a book, to insist to the interviewer that they're not all funny. And I think I get a sense sometimes that some reviewers are disappointed. I mean, I can understand it. But there's still a few funny ones dotted about.
I'm thinking now, just as you're talking of, annoyingly, I can't remember the name of the poem. It's a Larkin poem, which in fact I used as the epigraph of my first book. And it's the one about, written to Sally Amis, and it's about catching.
Oh, I hate that poem.
Do you? Oh, I absolutely adore it. Do you really?
Yeah, well, what he's wishing her is that she'll just be kind of dull and ordinary.
May you be dull, may you be dull. Yeah, not.
Well, who wants to be dull and ordinary?
Yes, I don't take it as that, but I do take it as it's the catching of happiness that I find entrancing in that poem. And I think one of the things that you do in poems like Being Boring is about this sense of catching happiness.
Right.
Because I do think that in the second phase of your career, there is a sense of, yes, stability, but also the fragility of happiness.
Absolutely.
And
Being Boring, I wrote that when I wasn't writing much. We actually had a little workshop group that met at our house, and there was a meeting coming up, and I thought, well, I'm too boring to write anything. So then I wrote the poem about being boring.
Yeah. And I think
not being bored. People start to get confused. I mean, across people say it's a poem about being bored. It's not about being
no,
bored.
not at all.
It's about being boring, which doesn't, that only affects other people.
Exactly. It's about being happy and the fragility of that and the pressure of that.
Yes.
Yeah. I was about to ask you something then that I completely forgot because I lost. Well, I'm thinking, would you read your poem Flowers, please?
Yes. This is a favourite of mine. I mean, I like the orange, but it's interesting to me that the orange is the one that's gone viral. I mean, well. I mean, I do like it, but I'm surprised that's the one. Anyway, this is my favourite, Flowers. Some men never think of it. You did. You'd come along and say you'd nearly brought me flowers, but something had gone wrong. The shop was closed, or you had doubts, the sort that minds like ours dream up incessantly. You thought I might not want your flowers. It made me smile and hug you then. Now I can only smile. But look, the flowers you nearly brought have lasted all this while.
Beautiful. I've always loved that poem.
Yes.
And I remembered what the thought that flickered that I then forgot, which was about, again, one of the striking things when Making Cocoa was published was how, and of course in all the poetry that's followed, was this sense of the everyday, not always deemed appropriate topics for poetry, being captured. I mean, I remember when I was in love briefly and disastrously at one point, remembering your poem about hugging the telephone book was going too far, and the corkscrew that that had been taken away by a lover, and of course the bloody men are like bloody buses, which anyone who's ever been single will identify with.
I think that's my daffodils, bloody men.
Yes, it probably is.
Larkin said, this beat the verse, which is the one about your mum and dad messing you up. I'm not quoting it in case. He said that would be his daffodils, and I think bloody. And I don't think he was particularly pleased about that. And I think bloody men is my daffodils, which doesn't particularly please me. But I mean, it's okay. I don't dislike it.
If you apart from the orange and flowers, if you were to pick another 2 or 3 favourites, what would they be?
What, from this book or?
Actually, from your entire work.
Yeah, there's some there's one called Dutch Portraits that I like very much that is in the orange. And there are several in my most recent book that I like a lot. I haven't done a reading for a long time, so I can't remember very well. I think some of the sonnets in Anecdotal Evidence I like very much.
Mm.
And the little poem called Evidence, which gives the book its title, which I think says something about poetry you'd probably agree with.
Absolutely. And I mean, you've always been a master-stroke mistress of form. Form has been very important in your work.
Yeah.
Do you have a favourite form?
The Shakespearean sonnet. Definitely. I mean, I used to write a lot of villanelles and triolets, and I still sometimes do, but I think the Shakespearean sonnet is my favourite form. There are other kinds of sonnets. I've only ever written one other kind of sonnet just to see if I could do it, but I love the way it clicks up with that final couplet, and it is a great pleasure if I've managed to write 12 lines and then I got to the bit where I've got to think of the final couplet. I just enjoy that so much. You've got to get it absolutely right. It doesn't matter how long it takes, but and once I've done this, I'll have a finished sonnet. I do like them very much. And
I imagine most people, well, I don't know how many people are poets here today, but can you have a go at describing the process of that tension between the discipline of form, wresting words into a corset in a way, and the emotion behind it? Is there a kind of catharsis in that? Can you just?
I think it really helps to have some kind of box to put it in. It really helps. I mean, I do write sometimes in forms. I don't like to say free verse, but not in traditional forms. I sometimes do that for some poems. That seems to be right. But somehow it somehow makes it easier. Look, and it's not just me that says this. Other poets, looking for the right rhyme word, you'll often come up with a better idea than you looking for the solution. And I don't quite understand this because it sort of seems magical to me. But I know I'm not the only poet that finds this, that looking for the technical solution can often bring you nearer the truth.
Yeah.
Which is weird, but it does happen.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a kind of alchemy, I suppose. And you said, I think I'm trying to remember the quote. What was it? You said you haven't read it. You said, I sometimes have to work myself into quite an aggressive state to be able to write.
Yeah.
Is that still true for you?
Not so much. No. I think I've just got a bit braver and more confident. But sometimes I think, well, especially in the days when I was facing more hostility, that I would get into this frame of mind where I think, well, they're all going to hate this, but I'm going to write it anyway. And I don't have to show it to anybody. I don't have to publish it, but I'm going to write it anyway. But to be brave enough to write what I wanted to write, I sort of had to work myself up into quite an angry state and say, sod them all, they're going to hate this. Well, let them hate it, Yeah, I don't have to do that so much nowadays.
So what state of mind would you say you are generally in when you write a poem?
Well, if I'm feeling quite emotional about something, that helps. I mean, because emotion helps to make a poem work. But I think, so if I'm feeling emotional about something, I know it's quite likely that there's a poem there, but I have to sort of find it. But it's not always the case. Maybe it is. I mean, even if it's about something like that poem By the River, I was very moved. If I'm moved by something. And it might be that I'm moved to laughter and even sneering. I mean, some of poems I've written where I am sort of making fun of things. But I suppose if I'm moved in some way, and it might be tears, it might be laughter, it might just be, something is so beautiful. I mean, sometimes, you see something so beautiful, you wish you could paint a picture, but I can't paint. So you do what you can with words.
And generally speaking, is there a kind of, will you work away at a poem for days, weeks, months? Can you, is there a kind of different length of time?
Not months, no. I mean, when I was, in the early days when I was, had a lot to learn, I mean, it took, used to work on poems for longer. Now, if I've got a good idea, which I don't have very often, then it doesn't take so long. But, I might have to have a go at it over a number of days, not all day. I mean, I can't work for long periods on a poem. I think 40 minutes is about my maximum. And then my mind sort of starts to lose steam and I have to get up and do something different because it's so intense. It's so intense that I realized, after about 30, 40 minutes, I'm not in the zone anymore. And so I have to go away and then I'll come back to it. But not months, no. Maybe over a period of a few days.
And this might be an impossible question to answer, but how do you know when it's finished?
Yeah, it is a difficult question to answer. Well, what will happen is I think it's finished. And then I'll be going over it in my mind and I realise, nah, that's not quite right. Or I'll show it to Lachlan and he'll point out something to me that isn't quite right. I mean, I've just finished work. I don't write many poems nowadays. I thought I'd completely finished, but I have written a couple of poems lately, and one of them was for a composer who wanted something, and he wasn't too happy with the first version I sent him, And so I said, okay, and I just worked, and he was right. I mean, I worked on it a bit more, and then it was much better. So that one, I thought it was finished, but and it can be very helpful to have that kind of feedback from somebody else. Somebody else pointed out that there was room for improvement, which is quite brave of him, but he was right.
Yeah.
And then I improved it. So this can, and sometimes occasionally editor at Faber, not very often, occasionally an editor will say that there's room, this could be better, and I'll do some more work. But mostly it's just me when I can keep saying it over in my head, and I don't see anything wrong with it, or I come back for and look at it. Yeah, when I stop seeing anything wrong with it, and I stop seeing anything that ought to be changed, then it's finished. And it's certainly, I don't work on poems for months anymore, maybe a few days.
Well, that's progress.
Yeah.
It's good to know that.
Well, of course, they're all very short. I mean, if I wrote longer poems, The River Girl took more than a few days.
Yeah. Well, maybe the short, yeah. There is an argument that the shorter, the harder, but anyway, we won't go there. I'm now going to ask questions from members of the book club. So we'll start with Glyn's question. Which books, poems, works have shaped you most as a writer?
It's funny, you said earlier you don't know what influences you, and that's true. But you do know what inspires you. I mean, so I can tell you, you've already mentioned some of my favourite poets, and such as Houseman and Emily Dickinson, but I'm not aware of it. I mean, when I first started writing, I look at the very early poems I wrote that weren't published, and some of them read like poor imitations of Sylvia Plath, and some of them read like poor imitations of T.S. Eliot. I didn't realise that at the time. But I was being very influenced by those poets without really realising it, and looking back, see, oh yes, that's all right. You work through those kind of influences.
Mm.
Have I answered the question?
I think so, yes. Joe wanted to ask about social media and how you felt when the orange went viral, but I've already asked that, so I won't do that one. Anne just also asked the same question about how you choose which poem. Well, okay, she's asked what was your process for the orange and other poems, which you've answered a bit, but she also wanted to know, how do you choose which poems make it into a collection? So more broadly, if you... Yeah,
this one was different because all these poems have been in collections already. So, this was a bit different, but with a collection, it can be quite difficult. And I know a lot of poets find it difficult. And I'm very lucky in that I've always had editorial help, which is not always true. I mean, some poets have to sort of go around tormenting all their friends. Shall I do this? Shall I do that? Whereas, I do ask Lachlan's advice, but I also ask my editor's advice. And sometimes a poem that really I didn't like very much, they've said, no, just leave it out. It is, yeah, also, I mean, the fact that, if someone's wanted to publish, I send poems to magazines, and if someone has wanted to publish it in a magazine, that makes me think it's all right. So that will go in. Mostly, I mean, I don't send poems out much. Well, I don't write much nowadays, but, if Hugo takes something for the Spectator, I'm really pleased. And I think, well, that one must, that must be all right. He doesn't take everything. And if he doesn't take it, I think, because I absolutely trust his judgment.
Mm.
So I think I'm better now at knowing what the good ones are. I mean, what in my collected poems, it's been interesting because I've been back through poems that didn't make it into collections and decided which ones should go into my collected poems. And there's far more from the early years, partly because I was writing for quite a long time before I got published a book. But there are quite a lot of poems that got left out of my early books that I now think are good and should be published. So they will be in my collected poems.
And why were they left? Why were they
Well,
left out, Wendy?
probably because my editor didn't like them, or sometimes because I wasn't, I used to, if the first person I showed a poem to didn't like it, I tended to take that seriously. And so that sometimes, because other people didn't like them, or I wasn't sure if they were very good. And looking at them now, after all these years, I can see that some of them were all right. But I also, even then, I asked advice from Lachlan and another friend, and from Matthew Hollis, who was then the poetry editor of Faber. I took a lot of notice of what he said. So I did have help choosing which ones to put in. But as the years go by and we get to my more recent books, there's not nearly as much that got left out that might have been publishable, because I think I got a bit better. And also there were some things where I know there were poems I didn't even show to my editor because I didn't think they were any good, or I'd showed it to somebody and they hadn't liked it. And then years later, there are one or two of the few in my second book that I realised it could have been in my first book, but I didn't have enough confidence about them. So, yeah. Has that answered the question?
I think so. And we touched on your humour already, but Fionn wants to know, says, many of your poems are funny. What can humour bring to a serious topic?
Well, I think laughter is often a question of recognising that something is true. If I'm reading and I see something that actually, yes, that's what I've always thought, but I've never sort of put it quite like that, or never admitted it to myself, that's wonderful. And it can be quite small, or if somebody says something to you. A friend said to me the other day, I always feel guilty if I can't peel back the cover, on a packet of ham or a packet of fish. I feel like a failure, she said. And I realised, yes, I feel like a failure if I can't pull the back. But I'd never admitted it to myself, that I actually feel like a failure if I can't do it, until my friend said, well, that's a very small thing. But I think, in poems that is something that somebody recognises.
Yes, which hadn't been articulated or.
Yes.
Yeah. And Stuart asks, as someone with a teaching background, do you have any advice on how we can make poetry accessible to young people, apart from going viral on TikTok, obviously?
Well, I think have poetry books in the classroom and encourage them to read it. There was one time when because I was the music specialist, I didn't always have a class of my own. And I used to go around to, give other people a break sometimes by just reading to their class. And I would read a selection of poems. And what happened was that kids would be asked their teachers, can I write a poem? Just reading them some poems and encouraging them to read. Especially, when they're little, not making them analyse it or say whether they like it or anything, and not telling them they've got to write a poem. But if they're actually reading poems and they're enjoying it, they'll probably start writing poems. So, yes, I think just reading them poems and leaving the books lying around so they can read them for themselves. That's all I've got to say about it, really. I'm talking about very young children, when it's more difficult when you get to secondary school and you've got to think about exams and critical analysis and all that sort of thing, which can absolutely kill it stone dead.
Although, yes, my sense, I never had a poet come into our school or anything like that, but now there are enormous schemes for, getting poets into schools and so on. So I think probably actually children have more access to live poets than certainly my generation did.
Yes, I don't. I suppose it works. We didn't ever have a poet come into my school, because I was there, and I don't know. I've seen Michael Rosen at work with a class of small children, and it was absolute magic. Yes, absolute magic. Yeah. So I suppose that is one way. But also if the teacher just reads it, although I think enthusiasm is caught, not taught. And if you've got a teacher who likes poetry, you will get to like poetry too. If you've got a teacher who likes art and craft, which I didn't, you'll get to like that.
Yeah. And final question is from Lucy. What would you like to be asked that you haven't been asked about your work?
Oh dear, I feel a failure.
Oh,
I really can't think what I would like to be asked about my work that I haven't been asked. I'm really sorry, Lucy. Really sorry. I'll think of something immediately. Immediately I've left the meeting, I will think of something.
well, some things that I've just realised that wasn't the last question, and we have 5 minutes left. So Max asks you, what are you reading currently?
I've just finished reading a novel called Everything's Fine by Cecilia Rabes, which has been a big hit in America. And I've just started reading Nina Stibbe's latest book, her diary of her time in London. That's downstairs. Upstairs in the bedroom, I'm reading a book by David Kynaston about Britain between 1962 and 1965, a history book. So that's what I'm reading at the moment.
When do you do your reading?
Sometimes in bed, especially if I can't sleep. And sometimes, well, I mean, I had a bit of time to kill before we started this, so I was reading upstairs over a cup of tea in the afternoon. And in the evening, if there's nothing on, yes, in the evening, if there's nothing on television. But we do watch quite a lot of television.
What's your?
We watch the news often. I mean, because Lachlan is a news addict, so I would have no trouble being on top of the news for your Sky thing, because we watch the news twice. And sometimes I say, look, I really want to watch a film. Could we just not watch the news twice this evening? Yeah.
I think my mother would have been the person who would have been the best at Sky News commentator, because she used to watch the news and listen to the news on the hour every hour.
Well, also I have the radio on a lot. Yes. And so if something happens in the night, I'll know about it by the morning.
So this is the final question. It's from Sophia. Can you share some advice for aspiring writers?
Yeah. Well, you have to, depending on what you want to write, you have to read a lot. You have to really like reading. And if you want to write poetry, you have to really like reading poetry. And if you're not interested in poetry, you might as well forget it. So I think you have to be a person who enjoys reading poetry, and you have to read poetry of the present day and of the past. And but on a more also, I mean, I went on quite a few Arvon courses. These are short courses. A lot of these people will have heard of them, but I find people haven't. Some people haven't. They're short courses, in various nice places around the country, where you go and live for 5 days with a small group of people and some tutors, and you get some feedback from published writers, and that can be very helpful as well. And also, not just the published writers, it's just you need to mix with other people who, when I first started writing poetry, I didn't have anyone to talk to about it. I tried talking to my friends who'd read English at university, but it turned out they didn't really know anything about it. Certainly not about present day poetry. And so then I found my way, to Blake Morrison's evening class, and also to these Arvon courses, where not only was there a teacher, which was very helpful, but also there are other people who were interested in poetry, who didn't think it was weird to want to talk about poetry all the time. And there are lots of groups, stanza groups run by the Poetry Society. There's one in Ely, run by a friend of mine. So yes, you need to seek out people who share your interest, and you need to read a lot. What else? Can you think of anything else, Christina? You're a writer.
Well, I'm not a poet. No, I think reading is the absolute key.
And also remember that there's quite a lot to learn. I mean, don't expect to write a poem and get it published next week. It took me several years apprenticeship before I wrote anything that was publishable.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Wendy. That was absolutely fascinating. Hay have asked me to say that early bird tickets for the Hay Festival 2024 in Wales are out now, and the full programme will be available in March. But most importantly, Do, if you haven't already, snap up a copy of The Orange. Thank you so much, Wendy, for bringing us a taste and some insight into your wonderful poetry tonight.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you very much indeed.